Welcome to Tales Told When the Windows Rattle. I'm Tim Prossel. I have before me a digital copy of the May 14th, 1880 issue of the Mansfield Reporter, Mansfield, England. Let me read you a couple of lines from an article there. Superstitions, ghosts, fairies, and witches vanish before the approach of steamboats and steam engines. We never hear of a haunted railway station, a bewitched locomotive, or a saloon carriage tenanted by other fairies than those of mortal mold. Now, I've seen this idea expressed in a few places. It's the idea that in our modern world of steam locomotives and train travel, ghosts are just going to vanish into the past. But the railroads introduced brand new, horrible ways of dying. And I don't just mean train wrecks, but also individual train accidents. These and their relationship with ghosts are discussed in the story I'm about to read to you, and it was published in 1875. That's 5 years prior to the article in the Mansfield Reporter. I now present Henry Tinson's story, Under the Sheer Legs. I never heard of a man who had seen a ghost on a railway till the instance which I am about to relate, though I don't know why ghosts should not be as plentiful on railways as anywhere else. Having for many years been assistant storekeeper at the London end of the direct meridian, I consider the locality of a locomotive depot favorable for ghosts. The long, gloomy sheds and empty workshops, with uncouth machinery lying about and enormous engines imperfectly seen in the daylight, were, after dark, as vague and full of mystery as any old monastery or castle could be. In addition, it was difficult to put your foot on a spot where some poor fellow had not been killed, or where, if an old hand as I was, you could not remember to have spoken to some stalwart driver or fireman before he started on the journey from which he never came back. Yet we had no ghosts about the place. In a few years we had a great change on the direct meridian. One of our principals retired, and his successor was a man who had risen from the ranks. Now, this rising from the ranks is all very fine in theory, but on a railway, at any rate, it does not answer. The men dislike serving under their old mates, who, when promoted, are often tyrants, taking a delight in going into 1,000 little matters which a gentleman would never notice, and making the service almost intolerable. Otherwise, they are good, kindly men enough, but obliged to see with others' eyes and hear with others' ears. Our new chief was one of the latter description. He was a most amiable man who did more mischief among his staff, and whose name was used to sanction more injustice in the first 12 months after his appointment than would probably have been the case under a martinet in 7 years. Our station, being in London, was, of course, a very important one, and a new superintendent was sent by the name Yules. He too had risen from the ranks, and the men who had fancied the previous gaffer, as chiefs are called on railways, a strict hand, soon found the difference to their cost. The worst feature about this new master was his treachery. He would talk to the drivers in a hearty, hail fellow, well met sort of way that, at first, made them think there never was such a man, and he would promise his influence to get them everything they wanted. But engine drivers are a shrewd class, and it was soon found that no matter what Yules said, if he did not have his own way or was not sufficiently cringed to, there was always some difficulty, never seeming to arise from him, however, which postponed a man's requests or got him into serious trouble. The old drivers, a set of North countrymen, didn't care for him or any living thing, and would as soon as gone and told the board of his tyranny as have smoked their pipes. This he knew, and so he avoided them accordingly. Toward the younger and more timid drivers, however, he was both deceitful and severe. Sim Fern suffered about the most from him. Sim was a poor, easy-tempered, nervous fellow, exactly the sort of man that Yules could terrorize. I am within bounds when I say that for 3 months Sim, who was a goods driver, never made a trip that he was not found fault with and bullied, for Yules did not feel it necessary to be smooth-faced with him. His nature was to bully, and he indulged it with all those he could frighten, and he did frighten Sim. I had seen the poor fellow wipe the tears from his eyes with the clean cotton waist I had just given him when about to start with his train. He has said, "Mr. Sayers, he means me ruin. I shall be sacked without a character, and then what will become of me children?" He had 5 very pretty little children, and when he used to see the 3 elder toddle off to Sunday school when he took the other 2 for a bit of a walk, I think he was the proudest and happiest of engine drivers. Of course, I did my best to cheer him up, but everybody knew that what he said was true, and that, do what he would never do right. At last poor Sim took to drinking, and came on duty once or twice, obviously the worse for beer. Yules positively chuckled at this. If the driver had not gotten into scrapes before, you may be sure he did not keep out of them now. He learnt from a youth, Bill Soames' son. Bill Soames was another driver, and his boy was in the office with Mr. Yules, that his train tickets had a closer examination than those of the other drivers, and that every trivial discrepancy in his entries was looked into and censured. With others, except for a few timid fellows like himself, they were passed over. It was dreadful to see how nervous Sim grew. His fireman had told me over and over again how he would sob like a child while talking of the persecution he suffered, how he would wish he was dead, and how he offered up strange, wild prayers while on the journey. It would take me too long to tell all the mischief Yules worked among the men and the dislike and dread everybody came to have of him. As storekeeper, I did not come much in contact with him, and so long as I kept things pretty straight, he had not much temptation to meddle with me. Things had gone on in this manner for some months. 2 of our drivers had been dismissed, 2 or 3 had left for other lines, and many had been fined. Among the latter was Sim, who had been fined so repeatedly for coming on duty intoxicated that he would have been discharged, only Yules liked to play with a mouse before he killed it. I remember very well one wet and windy afternoon about the beginning of February when Sim came into my office for his stores, as he was booked to take out the 6:50 train. He had been drinking, as usual, and I saw in the pocket of the rough jacket he wore over his slop a small bottle I knew he had been lately carrying full of gin. I was getting his stores together when young Soames ran in with a message for me from Mr. Yules. "Hullo, Slim," he exclaimed to the driver. "You are in for it again. Mr. Yules will be down on you this time." "He always is down on me," said Sim. "I often wish I was a convict, or that he was." "Well," said the young one, "I saw a letter on his desk half finished to the chief. He is reporting you nicely, and I expect you'll have the sack. I'm off early tonight, for I'm going to the play." And with that the youngster scampered away. Poor Sim said nothing, but looked at me as if he would look me through. I have seen but one man hanged, and I will take care to never see another. The look the poor wretch had given all around him when he came upon the scaffold was just like the desperate, hopeless look Sim Fern gave me then. He went off to his engine, for he was always early. He did all he could to keep straight with his masters, and was often in the shed 20 minutes before his fireman, although it was the latter's duty to be there first. About 25 minutes, or perhaps half an hour after this, just as I was thinking of locking up, one of our fitters ran in. His face was white as a sheet. "Mr. Sayers," he exclaimed, By George, Mr. Yules is killed. He is smashed to bits at the end of the shops. Staying for nothing after hearing this, I ran out of the stores with no need to ask where the accident was, for every man and boy was running out of the shops toward the sheer legs. The sheer legs is an enormous tripod formed of 3 massive poles united at the top and strong enough to bear our heaviest engines. When repairs to the lower parts of those engines are needed, they are slung under the legs by powerful chains, resting only on their fore or hind wheels as the case may be. These chains are worked by a crab, which is easily turned by a couple of men at the handles. When the end of the engine is hauled up as high as is wanted, a bolt or pin is thrust into the wheel of the crab, which holds it from running down. It was pitch black, of course, but the lanterns from the shed and the portable gas lamps from the shops showed a crowd of 60 or 70 grimy fellows round the legs. The foremen were shouting their directions, and everybody seemed scared. They made way for me, however, and I saw at once what had happened. Mr. Yules had got under the engine, which was easy enough to do, probably to examine it. By some unaccountable mischance, the pin of the crab had given way. The tremendous weight of the locomotive, the mastodon, one of our heaviest goods engines, had fallen upon him and crushed him to death at once. The front wheels were off, and it was the chimney end which had come down with such a fearful run, while the body of Mr. Yules was utterly smashed. Strangely enough, his head, with its staring eyes and bushy red whiskers, protruded from under the framing and seemed to be looking at us with a horrible grin about the mouth, a grin which almost turned me sick. The first thing to be done was to lift the engine. A couple of powerful screw jacks, as they were termed, were at once placed under it, near the hind wheels. The foremen were busy in directing the laborers and keeping the crowd back when the timekeeper and I left. We thought we might as well go into the dead man's office to see that nothing of consequence was lying about and to lock the room. It appeared that, before Mr. Yules had gone his usual round, he had been burning his papers, for there was not a scrap of a letter of any kind, whether written or received by him, to be seen on his desk. In the fender, quite cold and black, was a heap of tinder which had recently been paper. This we noticed, and after locking the office door, we went home. At the inquest, no one could account for the bolt slipping from the cogs. The general opinion was that it had not been pushed fairly home by the fitters who had lifted the engine. This they strenuously denied, arguing that it would not have held all day unless they had done so. It was suggested in reply that any accidental jar might have loosened it a little, and then the immense weight of the engine had pulled it down. At any rate, there was no doubt how Mr. Yules was killed, and a verdict of accidental death was returned. Nothing was ever heard of the report against Fern, and while the new superintendent had his own likings and dislikings, as they all have, he did not meddle much with Sim. I saw the latter pretty often, for he had come to me for his stores, and I was of the same opinion with the men, that Sim was going mad. Not only did he drink as much as before, but he grew very wild in his talk, and this not from drink. From some cause or another, the liquor he took never seemed to affect him now as it had once done. He never seemed tipsy, and although he talked strangely, it was not as a drunken man talks. You could always excite him by speaking of Yules. I have said that Fern was a quiet, timid fellow, and he was so, more than any man I ever saw. But if anyone mentioned our late gaffer, Fern would rave about him, cursing and swearing so that it turned my very blood, though I had heard a good deal of bad language in my time. But strangest of all was the queer way in which he used to mutter to himself about the dead master. When anything started the subject accidentally, he would go on growling and muttering as if he could see Yules standing by his side. At last, from one thing and another, poor Fern, instead of being the most popular man about the place, seemed to be so disliked and avoided that none of his mates cared to speak to him. This hurt him very much, I could see, but it was not to be wondered at. The only man who really stuck to him was his fireman, Dick Farmer. Fern had once done Dick a great service, and Dick never forgot it. In proportion, these two grew more friendly. In fact, the fireman twice fought men in the field at the back of our engine shed for insulting Sim. Neither of his antagonists came to work for a week afterwards. Well, things had gone on much as usual for, I suppose, 8 or 9 months, when, on a drizzling, miserable December evening, I had to take a message to the coke stage, which was about 1/4 of a mile below my stores. Coming back, I had to pass the shear legs to the back of my shops. It was about 6 o'clock, and the drizzling rain was blown in my face by a bitter wind. It was very dark, too, but so many lights were about that no part was so black but that you could see to pick your way and see the wet glistening on the metals. I had just reached the corner of the shops when an irresistible impulse made me turn round to look at the shear legs. I had passed them just before, and they were not more than 50 yards from where I stood. I knew that an engine was half suspended there, as was nearly always the case, but something made me turn round again. I saw the gigantic beams very distinctly, for a grate full of coals was burning close by, lighted by some men who were coming to work on the rails, and the shear legs were between me and the glare. There hung the black, enormous locomotive, and below it, just where the front wheels had been, stood a man in a tall hat and a long great coat. I was startled with surprise, for the figure had not been there a moment before, as I could have sworn. There was something so horribly familiar in its outline that, after I had instinctively moved toward it, I recoiled in terror. I was collected enough, though I felt the drops of cold sweat on my forehead, to remember how accidental combinations of familiar objects or changes in their position had often imposed upon and terrified men. I moved first to the right and then to the left, to see if doing so I disturbed the figure. Not a bit. It was still there. As I looked, it took off its hat and passed its hand through its hair with a manner that was the manner of Mr. Yules, who was killed. Yes, the figure was Mr. Yules, as I had known him many months before. There he stood beneath the engine, looking up at the monstrous mass hanging above him, just as Yules must have looked up a moment before the iron avalanche crushed him. So certain was I it was Yules, and so certain at the same time it could not be him, that I feared my brain was affected. I turned my eyes away from the sight with the same difficulty that a bird, as we are told, turns from the gaze of a serpent. I was conscious that I staggered in my walk. Then a voice on the bank by my side aroused me, a voice I almost dreaded lest my imagination had conjured up another spectre. "Well, Mr. Sires, you've seen him at last, then." The voice was that of Sim Fern, and it broke the spell. I looked round again, and there hung the locomotive. There the tall legs reared themselves, but all was dark, motionless, and void beneath them. Sim was descending a path down the slope, one by which the drivers often came to their work, and as I looked up at him, I saw he was perfectly sober and serious. "Seen whom, Sim?" I exclaimed, feeling as I spoke that I would rather have met anyone rather than Fern at that moment.
"Seen Yules, sir,"
returned the driver. "Why, what do you mean?" I asked, not at all liking to own what I thought I had seen.
"Don't be offended, sir,"
continued Sim,
"if I say it is of no use your trying to deceive me. Yules walks there every night, I believe. I have seen him 20 times at least, but I did not think that any other eyes than mine could see him."
"Why not, Fern? Why should you—" I began. Without seeming conscious of what I was saying, he resumed.
"He means something, Mr. Sayers, depend upon it, by his showing himself to a second party. It is a warning. I always come this way when it is me turn to take me train after dark, because if I did not come and see him at the legs, I know he would come and see me."
"My good fellow," I said, "you are ill. Go home now, lay up a day or two, and you will get your mind to rights."
"Is your mind wrong, Mr. Sayers?"
returned Fern.
"You know what you saw just now, and you are above denying it, sir. You are quite aware that you saw Yules under the engine." "So did I, and curse him, it is not the first time I have seen him there, the cowardly brute, and well he knows it. But I'm all right. Good night, sir. Don't you forget that I said it was a warning."
He disappeared behind the building, and I returned to the stores, dwelling more on his strange manner and stranger words than even on the mysterious appearance which I had witnessed. I determined to question Sim a little more when he fetched his stores, but his fireman came for them. We spoke as I was attending to him. Dick said, "It is a queer job, this about the engine, sir. I wish we had knowed it earlier." "What is wrong about them, farmer?" I asked.
"Why, don't you know they have changed our engines?"
exclaimed the man.
"The Colossus has got a leaky tube, and so they have given us the Mastodon, the engine that killed Mr. Yules."
"Good heaven!" I ejaculated, almost involuntarily.
"Yes, it's very unlucky,"
continued the fireman.
"If I had knowed it before, Sim never should have—"
Here he checked himself as though afraid of saying too much. Bidding me good night, he left. I left too, almost immediately after. I had some doubt about telling my wife what I had seen. However, I decided upon doing so, and found she considered it, using the very words of Fern, a warning. As for myself, I hardly knew what to think of it all, and lay awake half the night, nervous and excited. In the morning, I went to work. I was passing the policeman at the gate. He said,
"A bad job, Mr. Sayers, about poor Fern."
"Why, what has happened?" I returned, and I felt myself trembling all over.
"Killed, sir, last night before he had got 20 miles on the road. He was under the engine oiling her, for she had not been running for some time before, while they were in the goods siding at Baybridge, and by some accident which nobody can understand, she slipped forward a little. The connecting rod struck him on the head, and of course killed him directly." I stopped to hear no more, but went on to the stores, where everyone was full of the accident. In the course of the morning, Farmer returned, another driver and fireman having gone on with the train. Dick was very much distressed at the loss of his comrade, concerning whose death he gave just the same account as I had already heard. He could only suggest in explanation that the train, having been brought to a stand on an incline, some of the hinder trucks might have slipped a little, and so given an impetus which moved everything slightly. This theory was eventually adopted at the inquest. Farmer soon afterwards gave notice to leave, as he had obtained an engagement on an Indian railway, where he did very well. In fact, he was a first-rate hand, and is now a foreman on the line he joined. I had never mentioned to him what I had seen. Just before he had left, however, Dick came to me to say that poor Sim had spoken a good deal about me on the last trip. He said that I had seen the ghost of Yules. I admitted this, as I was sure there was more to be told. Dick went on to say that from the moment Sim found out he was to drive the Mastodon, he coupled that fact with my having seen the ghost and made up his mind that he should never come back alive. If he really were killed, Dick was to be at liberty to tell me, as the only other person to whom the spirit of Yules had appeared, what Dick had long known. Sim had, in a fit of desperation, caused the death of the superintendent. Sim had seen him standing under the engine, examining it with his lamp. No one was near, and all his insults and tyranny rushing at once into the driver's excited mind, he pulled out the bolt from the crab and let the engine down with a run. He had then gone into the office and burnt every scrap of writing he could see on Yules's table, so that nothing should remind his successor of the report against himself. All this Dick had known, but he would assuredly rather have died than reveal it, save at Sim's desire. Even now, it was perfectly clear that he failed to see any harm in the murder of Mr. Yules. I kept the secret until I left the line. I now venture to tell it and to declare, doubt it who may, I have seen a railway ghost. Henry Tinson's Under the Sheer Legs. Do an image search for railway sheer legs. You have to include railway or railroad, otherwise you're just going to get stockings. But these things are impressive looking. They're really just a great big tripod, and you use them to hoist a steam locomotive so that you can work underneath it. I would not be surprised if many people died under these things, but what an interesting murder weapon. We knew all along that it was Sim Fern, right? Or we're at least 99% sure. We didn't need the big reveal at the end because he's the only one we know who has a motive, and he's acting strangely. So that's not really what this story is about. It's not a whodunit. It's much more about, will justice be served? And if so, how? Will it be the police, or will it be some other kind of agency? Now, I've been working on railroad ghost stories for quite a while, and I find that for the most part, there are a few exceptions, but for the most part, they fit pretty neatly into various categories. And I would put this story, Under the Sheer Legs, into the category that I call Danger Signals from Beyond. There are quite a few very interesting ghost stories in which the ghost, or whatever the supernatural manifestation happens to be, is a warning of danger further down the line or further in the future. And it raises really interesting philosophical questions, such as, if you know the future, are you stuck with that future? Can you change that future? Or do you make that future happen? Shakespeare's Macbeth plays around with that a little bit. Oedipus Rex plays around with a character who knows the future but can't really change it at all. You can find a whole bunch of these stories in a book titled After the End of the Line, Railroad Hauntings in Literature and Lore. In fact, that's the first group of stories. The second group of stories is Phantom Trains. Here, the entire train is a ghost, and there are a few stories of a living person who accidentally got onto one of these phantom trains, and the challenge is, how do I get off of this thing? The third category I call Wraiths on the Rails, and here we have a fairly conventional ghost, if there is such a thing as a conventional ghost, but somebody who has died by being hit by a train, or in some way or another. There's a haunted depot, there's a haunted stretch of tracks.
Again, the title is After the End of the Line. You can find out more about it at brownbonesbooks.com. While you're there, you might want to take a look at a project that I call Railroad Hauntings You Can Still Visit. I find old newspaper articles about a railroad haunting, and then I do some research and I find out if you can still visit the site. It might be a curve in the tracks, or it might be a depot. Maybe do a little ghost hunting if you're interested in it, or just take a walk by it if it's in your area. Once again, the name of the book is After the End of the Line, Railroad Hauntings in Literature and Lore. You can find out more about that at brownbonesbooks.com. I'm Tim Prossel, and thanks very much for listening.